Welcome in or welcome back. Today we are going to be reading part 2 of the Eclipse Chronicle, the August Reckoning, a mythological epic in 5 paths, regarding the astrological placements for July 20th through the 29th, the full moon that's going to be on the 29th, and then August 12th, flash forward from there to August 12th to be an idea of like kind of what the culmination of all of these extremely rare alignments are culminating to. Okay, written in the year of the dragon's tail upon the royal star when the moon prepared to devour the sun. The Barbolt basket is, I guess Andres Barbolt discovered this back in the day, a really long time ago, and this is supposedly extremely rare. These alignments that have been going on since, I think, the 17th of July? I don't know, don't quote me on that. Okay, so part 2, let's just dive in. Part 2, The Descent. This is basically just, like a story based off of these dates, astrology, and it's the most astronomically accurate astrology that I am able to figure out, okay? Or that I have been able to figure out. Okay, so part 2, The Descent, July 23rd to the 25th. So, part 2, part 1, Callista and Siren, the road meeting. On the morning of the 23rd of July, Callista emerged from her underground library into the kind of sunlight that always struck her. After days below, as almost aggressive, the quality of it, the weight of it, the way it insisted on illuminating everything without asking whether everything wanted to be illuminated, she stood at the entrance to the volcanic tunnels with her traveling pack and her leather case of transcription tablets, and she blinked until her eyes adjusted, and then she began to walk. She had the scroll's translation complete in the living tongue on clean vellum, rolled and sealed with her own mark. The glyph she had designed at the age of 12, that was a combination of the astronomical symbol for Mercury and the oldest known written character for the word truth, which in the original language was the same word as the word for poison. A etymological coincidence that she had considered frequently and with great care. She would carry it to Lysander's palace herself. She had no other choice. The voices had been very clear on this point. The translation required a translator present. A document alone would be deflected, denied, reinterpreted. A document carried by someone who spoke with the authority of the dead, that was different. That was harder to dismiss, though people would try. On the second day of her journey on the road that ran along the spine of the coastal hills, before descending toward the inland plateau, she came around a bend and found a person sitting on a stone wall, eating dried fruit from a tin and staring south with the focused, hungry expression of someone watching for something that isn't there yet, but is on its way. Callista stopped. The person on the wall turned and looked at her. They regarded each other for a moment with the particular quality of mutual recognition that has nothing to do with having met before. "You're going north," Saren said. It was not a question. "I am," said Callista. "And you are going south." "Yes." Saren looked back toward the horizon. "Do you know what's there, south, at the end of a 3-week road?" Callista set down her pack and sat on the other end of the wall. The voices in her were quiet, which usually meant they were listening. "I know what the sky says is there," she said. "A gate. The place where Antares and Aldebaran hold the horizon between them, and what has been built between a soul and its freedom becomes not smaller, but permeable, passable." Saren looked at her. Something in their expression shifted. Not relief, exactly. More like the recognition of a word in a language you thought you were the only speaker of. "How do you know about the Axis?" "Because the dead know everything," Callista said simply. "And I carry the dead." They sat in silence for a while. A hawk circled above the road. The coastal hills smelled of dry stone and wild thyme. "Tell me," said Saren at last. "Tell me, what waits at the gate? Not the geography, the cost. What it asks." Callista was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had that quality it sometimes had, slightly layered, as though more than one person was using it. "The wall between you and your release is made of something you are still carrying that belongs to a self you are no longer. You will need to surrender it at the gate. Not lose it, surrender it, consciously, knowing what you're putting down and why. The wall does not dissolve in ignorance, only in full seeing. And if I can't see it clearly enough, then you stand at the gate and Saturn holds you there," Callista said, "until you can." Saren absorbed this the way they absorbed most things that frightened them, very quietly, without visible reaction, in a way that those who knew them well had learned to recognize as processing at depth. "What are you carrying north?" they finally said. "A truth that will destroy a man's understanding of himself," Callista said, "and possibly save him." "Those are not mutually exclusive." "No," said Callista. "They rarely are." She stood, shouldered her pack. "The eclipse is on the 12th. I believe we will see each other again before that." "I think so too," said Saren. They stood as well, brushing combs from their coat. "Will it be all right in the end?" Callista looked at them with eyes that contained more history than her 35 years should have permitted. "I have seen enough endings to tell you that all right is not the right category," she said. What I can tell you is that the other side of this exists. That there is an other side. And that the people who reach it do so by walking through, not by finding a way around. They parted at the fork in the road, Callista north toward the palace, Saren south toward the mountains, and neither of them looked back, which was either dignity or the avoidance of the particular sadness of watching someone walk away from you toward a fate you cannot follow them through. Part 2. Lysander, the Oracle, arrives. He had kept the untranslated scroll on his desk for 3 days, returning to it at intervals, the way a person returns to an untreated wound. Not to treat it, but to confirm it is still there, and to recalibrate one's relationship to the fact of it. His archivist had been unable to translate it, though the archivist's inability had been accompanied by a visible relief that Lysander found deeply unnerving. 2 scholars from the city's academic institutions had been summoned, examined the scroll, and left without speaking. One of them, on the way out, had made a hand gesture that Lysander recognized as a ward against ill fortune, though the scholar had tried to make it look like he was smoothing his robe. On the morning of the 25th of July, the woman arrived at the palace's upper gate. She was younger than he'd expected. The authority in her bearing had prepared him for someone much older, and she carried a plain leather case and a traveling pack, and she wore the expression of someone who had long since passed through the stage of being nervous about anything, and arrived at a more interesting territory on the other side of it. When she was brought to his study, she looked at the scroll immediately. Before she looked at him, and she said, "Yes, that's the one." "You know the document?" Lysander said. "I know what it contains," Callista said. "My name is Callista. I come from the library beneath Etherion. I speak for the voices that have been waiting for someone to receive what they have to say." She set her case on his desk beside the scroll and looked at him directly. He was aware of feeling, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely examined. "Will you hear me, my lord, knowing that what I say cannot be unsaid?" The pressure at the base of his skull that had been there since the day the seal broke intensified. "I am a man who has governed for 30 years, Lysander said. "I have heard things I wish I hadn't. Speak." Callista opened her case and withdrew a roll of vellum. She set it beside the clay tablet she had also brought, the original, in its ancient astronomical script, and she unrolled the translation and laid it flat on the desk, with one hand, while she placed her other hand on the ancient tablet. When she touched the tablet, something happened to her voice. It didn't change exactly. It remained her voice, but it acquired depth, the way a single note acquires depth when it is joined by harmonics. As though behind her voice there were other voices, quieter, older, speaking in the same register. This document, she said, is a genealogical record. It was compiled by the last archivist of the old dynasty in the final year before the transition of power. It has been preserved for 80 years in anticipation of this delivery. She paused. It concerns your grandmother on your father's side, the woman whose portrait hangs in the East Corridor, the one in the blue dress with the lion at her feet. Lysander said nothing. His grandmother, he had loved his grandmother. She had died when he was 4, but the portrait had been there his whole life. The blue dress, the imperious expression, the lion curled at her feet like a very large and well-trained cat. Her name, Callista said, in a layered voice, was Sarah. She was brought to your grandfather's household at the age of 14 from the eastern provinces as an indenture. Your grandfather, she paused, and for a moment several of the layered voices behind hers seemed to pull at her, and she steadied herself with visible effort. Your grandfather was a man of considerable ambition and limited legitimate claim to the power he held. When the old dynasty ended, he was not, as the family history records, an ally of the transition. He was its engineer. And when he consolidated his position, he also consolidated his household. Sarah became his wife by another pause, another steadying, by legal instrument, not by choice. The silence in the study was total. Through the open window, the sea moved with its usual indifference. She was a slave, Lysander said. His voice was entirely flat. My grandmother was a slave. She was a person who had been enslaved, Callista said, with a precision that, under other circumstances, might have seemed pedantic. The distinction matters. And my grandfather took what he wanted and built what he built on it, Callista said, as men of his kind have always done. And as the record has always preserved for the moment when someone was prepared to read it. She looked at him steadily. The Regulus bloodline you have claimed as your birthright, the royal lineage, the divine appointment, it exists. You do carry it, but it does not come through your grandfather. It comes through Sarah. Through her line, which predates your grandfather's ambitions by 4 generations and connects to a tradition of governance that was not about dominion, but about service. Her voice shifted again. The lion's star is in you, but what it means, what it has always meant, and the oldest interpretation before the kings appropriated it for their crowns is not rule. It is responsibility, not the right to demand tribute. The obligation to protect those who have none. Lysander stood at his window with his back to her for a long time. She did not rush him. Outside, the afternoon light was doing the thing it did in late July, going amber, going golden, making everything look temporarily like it had been gilded, like a painting of itself, like something that was being preserved rather than something that was alive. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost something. Not volume, he was still fully audible, but a register had gone out of it, a specific frequency that, she realized, was the frequency of a man who had never doubted that the story he tells about himself is the true one. "How many people know this?" he said. "The dead know it," Callista said. "They have always known it. The living, not yet. That is a decision that belongs to you." He turned from the window. His face, she noted, looked its age for the first time since she had arrived. Not old, but honest. Which is sometimes the same thing. "Will you stay?" he said. "Tonight, I would like..." He stopped. "I think I need to hear all of it, whatever else the record contains." "I will stay," Callista said. "There is much in the record, and the night is long." Part 3, Morrigan. The three women and the choice. They came to her separately, which was how she had known they were connected, because three women from the same village would never, under normal circumstances, have found independent reasons to walk to the marsh edge within 2 days of each other. Villages have memories, and the memory of Morrigan's departure was not a comfortable one, and the path to her cottage involved walking through a stretch of marsh grass that was, on warm nights, loud with frogs and dragonflies and the movement of things in the water that were perfectly natural and perfectly capable in the imagination of someone already anxious of becoming something else. The first was Delia, the weaver, who came on the evening of the 21st and stood at the edge of Morrigan's firelight with the expression of someone doing something they had decided not to think about too carefully. She was 50, rough-handed, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and had become better than that since. She had an old scar along her jaw from a fall she'd taken in her 20s, or so the village story went, the fall story, which Morrigan had always known was not the true story, but had never been asked to say so. "I need to tell someone," Delia said, without preamble. "And there's no one in the village I can tell. You were always..." She stopped, looked at the fire instead of at Morrigan. "You saw things, even then, even before they... I need to tell someone who won't..." who can hold it. Come and sit, Morgan said. I'll make tea. The second was Fern, the school teacher's widow. On the morning of the 22nd, she was 45 and had a precision about her speech that came from years of living with a man who had required very exact language at all times, usually in the service of making her feel imprecise. She had survived him by 6 years and was still in the process of learning how much of her vocabulary was hers and how much she had adopted as defense. She came with bread as an offering, which Morgan accepted. The third was Anya, who had been 19 when Morgan was exiled and was now 37 and had a daughter of her own, and had waited 18 years to say what she came to say. She brought nothing. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, and she said, I saw it happen. I was there. I was 12, and I hid behind the grain store, and I watched, and I have not slept cleanly since. Morgan sat with all three women over the course of 2 days, and she heard what each had to say, and what each had to say was different in its particulars and the same in its architecture. A man had done a thing, and the thing had been covered, and the covering had required a story, and the story had required a scapegoat, and the scapegoat had been Morgan. 23 years old, and already strange enough that the village had been looking for a reason. The man's name was Calder. He was 60 now, the village's wealthiest merchant, beloved of the council, grandfather of several, known for his generosity at festival times. He had no idea that the three women had come to the marsh. He was almost certainly asleep in his large house on the main street with the easy conscience of someone who had rewritten their history so thoroughly and so long ago that the revision had calcified into something they experienced as memory. Morgan sat alone in the dark on the second night after Anya had left, and she held the accumulated weight of what she had heard. She expected to feel rage. She had been waiting for rage for 18 years. Not because she wanted it, but because she had read enough of the old texts to know that rage was the appropriate first response to injustice, and that the absence of it was usually just injury so deep it has gone numb. What she felt instead was something colder and cleaner and harder to name. It was not the hot feeling. It was the feeling of a door opening, slowly, on old hinges, onto a room that had been sealed since she was 23. And in the room, there was not rage, but something that had grown in the sealed dark and was now quite large and quite calm, and was waiting for her to decide what to do with it. She lay down on the marsh grass with her face turned up to the sky. Antares was visible in the south. It always was on clear nights this time of year, burning its red coal light down through the atmosphere, the heart of the scorpion, the star of death and resurrection. She stared at it for a long time. I hear you, she said, to the star, to the dark water, to the voice she had been arguing with in her sleep for 2 weeks. I hear the question. I'm deciding. Toward dawn, the dream came again. the dark-haired woman in the marsh water, serpent-crowned this time. She had not been crowned before. With scales like oil on dark water and eyes like the inside of a shell, iridescent and ancient. She held out both hands. In one hand, the blade. Narrow, bright, efficient. The instrument of severance, of justice, administered by force, of the satisfaction of watching something be cut open. In the other, the root, thick and dark and knotted, something underground come up into the light. The instrument of medicine, of exposure, of bringing the hidden thing up into the air where it can be seen and known and named. Morgan looked at both hands for a long time in the dream. Then she reached out and took the root. The woman in the water smiled, and her smile was the oldest thing Morgan had ever seen, and she dissolved into the black water like ink, spreading out until the whole marsh held her, until the marsh was her. Until Morgan was floating in a body that was both water and goddess, and the dark, fertile power of every buried truth waiting to rise. She woke at dawn with mud in her hair and the decision made. Goddamn! That was... okay. Alright, so we're gonna keep going. I want to try to get part 3 done here. Alright, part 3, The Ordeal, July 26th through the 28th. 1. Zephyr, the counter wave. The thing about a lightning bolt is that it doesn't ask you whether you're ready for what comes after. It strikes and it illuminates, and the thunder is already on its way, and the fire is already started. And whether you prepared for the fire or not is a question that will be answered by the fire itself, not by your intentions. By the 26th of July, the counterwave had organized itself into something Zephyr had not fully anticipated, which was embarrassing in retrospect because they had always known, in theory, that this was how it worked. That every liberation has its shadow. That every Gemini truth has its twin. That the same network that carries signal carries noise, and that distinguishing between them in real time when both are moving at the same speed requires a clarity of mind that is very difficult to maintain when you are also being hunted. The state had been slower than expected. This was the gift of the conjunction, the Uranian speed that had outpaced the institutional response. But by the 6th day, it had organized, not through the overt mechanism of arrest, though that was coming. Zephyr was not naive about this, but through the subtler mechanism that powerful institutions always reach for first, the seeding of doubt. Specific documents from the transmission had been isolated and surrounded by context that altered their meaning. Specific voices that had been amplified by their release were now being counter-amplified with contrary claims. 2 people within Zephyr's own network, people they had trusted, people they had chosen, had either broken under pressure or had always been something other than what they appeared, and either way, the effect was the same. Information that was true was being contaminated by proximity to information that was false. And in the resulting noise, some of the people who had first believed were beginning to waver. Zephyr sat in the basement of the print shop and felt the specific vertigo of having released a thing that was still in motion and could no longer be controlled. This was the thing about Uranus. The lightning didn't stop to take instructions. You struck, and then it went where it went. And all you could do was watch and try to ensure that you were still standing and coherent enough to matter when the landscape settled. You need to move, Agatha said, from the chair she had occupied at the top of the basement stairs for approximately 72 hours. With a cup of tea that was perpetually hot and in an expression that suggested she had survived a great many more exciting situations than this one and was prepared to survive several more. Tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight. I'm not done, Zephyr said. You are done with this location, Agatha said. The work continues, but not here. She paused. There are old tunnels under the port district. Predate every administration that has ever tried to claim this city. I know the entrance. I know someone at the other end. She gave Zephyr the look of a woman whose knowledge was old enough and comprehensive enough that it no longer required explanation. You go tonight. You take what you absolutely need. You leave the rest. The manifesto, Zephyr said. I haven't finished the manifesto. Then you finish it underground, Agatha said. Or on a boat, or wherever you end up. She stood with the slight creak of someone who had been sitting in the same chair for 3 days, and held out a key. The tunnel entrance is under the south floor of the cooperage on Chandler Street. The key opens the cooperage. In the tunnel, you follow the smell of the sea until you find the other end. Do not follow any other smell. Zephyr took the key. They looked at the monitoring screen where the propagation map showed the transmission spread, still moving in some directions, still accelerating, and they took a photograph of it in their mind, the full spread of it, the pattern of all those points of light in all those cities, like a constellation that hadn't existed a week ago. Because it hadn't. They had made it. That was real, regardless of what came next. Thank you, they said to Agatha, for everything, for the years of it. Go, she said, and turned back to her tea, and did not watch them leave, which was either because watching would be too painful or because she was already thinking about what needed to be done next. And in Agatha's case, these things were not mutually exclusive. Part 2, Morrigan, The Great Reckoning. She chose the 27th, which was market day, which was the day when everyone in the village was in the square, which was not a coincidence. Scorpio does not whisper. Scorpio speaks in places where it cannot be denied. She walked in from the marsh road in the full heat of the morning, which was considerable. July was not gentle here, and she was wearing the marsh clothes, The dark, practical clothes that she always wore, not the dramatic robes that the village's imagination had assigned to her over the years in various anxiety-driven fictions about what a witch wore. She was carrying nothing. She had left the blade in a dream, and the root she carried inside of her, which is where medicine lives. The market stalls were full. The square smelled of bread and fish, and the flowers that the children sold in bundles in summer. And there was the sound of commerce and gossip and the particular social music of a community at ease with itself. People noticed her immediately. The conversations did not stop. They changed register, became aware of themselves, like music that suddenly knows it's being recorded. She walked to the center of the square where the old well stood, and she climbed its stone rim, and she stood there until she was visible above the heads of the crowd. And then she began to speak. She did not shout. She had learned in her years in the marsh that the voice didn't need volume to carry. It needed clarity and stillness, and the silence that she had built around herself, like a house, would do the rest. She spoke in the ordinary voice of a woman with something to say, and because the crowd had gone very quiet very quickly, everyone heard her. She spoke for a long time. She spoke of what had been done, and by whom, and when, and who had seen it, and who had pretended not to, and what the silence had cost. Not in abstract terms, not in the language of accusation that invites denial, but in the specific, patient, devastating language of witness. Delia's scar, Fern's precision of speech, that precision that was armor, Anya, 12 years old, hiding behind the grain store, spending the next 25 years awake in the dark with something she could not put down because no one had ever given her a place to set it. She spoke Calder's name. She spoke it clearly, without decoration or theatrical weight. Just the name, which is all that naming requires. And she spoke what he had done, and what had been done to cover it, and how the covering had required her, and what 18 years in the marsh had felt like, though she was careful. She was very careful, because the root and not the blade had been her choice, not to make the speech about herself. It was not about herself. It was about the three women who had come to her at the marsh edge, and the others they represented, and the long tradition of communities that seal their own wounds by applying the seal to the person who notices the wound is there. Calder was in the square. He had been buying cheese at the market stall nearest the well, and had turned when the voice began, and he was standing very still in the way that people who have spent a great deal of energy maintaining a story stand when the story is being told differently. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to matter, long enough for it to be clear that it was not the silence of shock, but the silence of recognition, the sound of a community encountering its own suppressed knowing, which it had been carrying for 18 years in the same way Saren carried their karmic weight, not as knowledge, but as a heaviness it had never found words for. Then someone spoke. It was not one of the three women. It was an older man, a farmer who had who she had never spoken to, who said simply, "I knew, I always knew, I was a coward." And then another voice, and then another, and then the voices began the process. Not comfortable, not resolved, not finished, not by a long way, of truth, moving through a community that had sealed it. And the feeling of the seal breaking was not relief, not yet. It was pain. The particular pain of a wound finally cleaned, which is not the absence of pain, but the beginning of the different kind. Calder left the square without speaking. Morrigan climbed down from the well rim. Delia found her and took her hand without saying anything, and they stood together for a while in the sun, in the smell of bread and fish and summer flowers, in the changed air of a place where truth had been told and could not be untold. Later, walking back to the marsh, Morrigan felt something she had not felt in a very long time and needed several hours to identify. Lighter, not healed, not finished, not even particularly at peace. There were weeks of complexity ahead. Community process, the legal question, the social fallout, all the ordinary, difficult human work that followed the extraordinary moment of revelation. But lighter, as though the root had taken something from her as well as from the ground, and what it had taken was the weight of being the only one who knew. Part 3, Lysander, the Dismantling. They came as Pluto's agents always come, not in a single dramatic arrival, but in the accumulation of small, relentless arrivals that collectively constitute a flood. The tax assessors on the 27th, with their new formulas and their revised valuations of Pallas and its estates. The creditors on the 28th, with debts that Lysander had believed were managed, that turned out to have been managed in a way that required a certain arrangement of power to remain viable, and the arrangement was shifting. The tributary representatives reconsidered their tributes. The grain masters discovered that their contracts contained provisions that Lysander's lawyers had inserted 30 years ago, and that were now being turned against him by lawyers representing interests he had barely been aware of as interests. He understood standing in his marble hall on the morning of the 28th, with Peleus presenting him with a financial summary that bore no relationship to the financial summary he had believed himself to be living inside of. That the dismantling was not personal. Or it was not only personal. It was structural. Pluto, working through structure, always looked personal because it arrived in your personal life. But the force behind it was much larger than any individual grievance. It was the accumulated pressure of everything that had been built on borrowed foundations, coming due all at once. Jupiter was still working in him simultaneously, which was the most disorienting part. The inflationary impulse, the part of him that reached for the grand gesture, the sweeping declaration, the dignified speech that would reframe everything, was still fully present, pulling in the opposite direction from the sinking feeling of the ground, and the opposition between them produced a psychological weather that was unlike anything he had previously experienced. Simultaneously feeling vast and small, simultaneously reaching up and being pulled down, simultaneously believing everything could be recovered and knowing that recovery was not the right word for what was on offer. Callista had left that morning. Before she left, she had said something he was still turning over. You have spent 30 years asking what you are owed. The question that is waiting for you is what you owe. They are not the same ledger. He stood at his parapet and looked at the sea, and he thought about his grandmother Sarah, and he thought about a 14-year-old girl brought from the eastern provinces by an ambitious man, and he thought about the portrait in the east corridor, the blue dress, the lion at her feet. And he thought, she didn't look conquered in the portrait. She looked patient. She looked like a woman who was waiting for something that was taking a very long time to arrive. I think, he said to Peleus, who was standing at a respectful and anxious distance, that we need to call the council. All of it, including the representatives from the outer villages. He paused, including the ones from the eastern provinces. Peleus's expression shifted through several states in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been hope, and finally, the professional neutrality he was very good at. My lord, may I ask, to what end? To the end of beginning something, Lysander said. He did not know yet what this something was. He was only certain that it had to start with an assembly, and that the assembly had to include people he had been treating as the audience of his rule, rather than as its subject and its purpose. Call them for the first week of August. We will need the time to prepare. And the financial situation, let it unfold, Lysander said, which was either wisdom or resignation, and he suspected it was both. The marble will still be here. The sea will still be here. Let the arrangements that were built on borrowed foundations return to the creditors. We'll see what's left, and we'll build from there. He paused again, honestly this time. Alright, we're gonna have to leave it there. I'm running out of time here. The next video, we'll pick up on part 4. Okay. And then we will continue on to the next chapter. Alright. So, with that being said, I bid you adieu.